Welcome back to another episode of Western Tabletop and the HMG podcast. We just recently had the Band of Brothers event here in Perth, Western Australia, and I was the TO. This event's the third or fourth time Band of Brothers has run, and this version was called Combined Arms. I wanted to do a deep dive into the event. The event has some interesting formats, some cool new ideas, and I wanted to talk about where they came from. So that's going to be the core of this video. There's going to be some details about this event that I'm going to gloss over. The vast majority we're actually going to cover. However, the player's pack is in the description for those of you who are playing at home. This event came from a desire to challenge our local player base and to introduce a few other things and new concepts. I'm also going to cover the prep work that goes into the event, as well as some post-event analysis. So if you're somebody who likes data, stay tuned for the end of the video. I really wanted to kind of communicate what it takes to be a TO and where the ideas come from, and more so to show you that it doesn't really matter what you do. If you host a Bolt Action event, your players will come. So what is Band of Brothers? Band of Brothers is a 3-player team event. If you have played a teams event in a wargaming system of any kind before, that's probably all the explanation you need. For those of you who haven't, it's a 3-round event. You're going to be playing a series of 1v1s in each round. It's not 3 versus 3s. Included in the Band of Brothers pack is secondary objectives. I think these are a really important part of the pack and very iconic, as well as some atypical list building incentives and some structures around providing new lists. And I'll get to the whys of that in a moment. And lastly, there's a drafting or a matchup mechanic. The idea is that when 2 teams are matched up, they will go through a drafting process to see who fights who exactly out of that team of 3. And this is where those list building incentives really come to play. So what is the challenge that I wanted to issue to the players? And really the first and most important one is I want people to have the best time ever. And where that comes from is the fact that if I look back at my wargaming history, the days that I've enjoyed the most, or the tournaments that I've enjoyed the most, have been team tournaments. You get this amazing sense of camaraderie in the lead up to the event, and you forge all of these new relationships with people you might not necessarily play with or even know in the community. That's certainly been my experience, and that's something that I wanted to bring to the Bolt Action community here where I am in Western Australia. The other main challenge that I wanted to communicate or distill is an improvement in game knowledge. When I say improvement in game knowledge, I mean things like list construction, learning to play and play against new lists, also test long-held beliefs about the meta. I also want people to have the ability to assess matchups between lists on lots of different criteria, not just the 1 or 2, as well as being forced to assess the terrain that's available on a table. Finally, working through some strategic and tactical planning. So what does that actually mean? If you have a team format, you usually can't bring all of the victory points from the game back to your team, and that's true in Band of Brothers. Which means that for your team to do well, you need to make sure that you are winning big and by big margins. That's the nice bit of tactical planning. The strategic planning, of course, is that if you have a favorable matchup, and you can see that your other people in your team have really bad matchups, you might want to look at changing those matchups, changing your drafting process so that all of you get pretty good matchups. Or alternatively, you might put the bad matchup on one of your players, but that means the other 2 get really good matchups, which means your team is going to win. And that's really the key thing. The tactical planning is typical that you would get at any tournament or event. This is the mission that you're playing. This is my list. This is your list. And we're going to figure out how to win from there. The great thing that we can do in a team event like this is you can push the speed of that tactical planning up a lot. The last part of that interplay between the 2 is that if my list is really good at one thing, but it has this obvious weakness, another player on my team can have a list that has the opposite strengths and weaknesses. And with that way, our team can present a lot of strengths and we can cover each other's weaknesses. Alternatively, you could choose as a team to have lists that are quite similar, or perhaps don't have such a huge skew in strengths and weaknesses. And that way, you're not super dependent on having a successful matchup process. Another element of that strategic planning and tactical planning actually is having custom missions. And I think that's really important, is that I don't necessarily want players to be forced to play the same missions as well. And that way we can provide new challenges and try to understand these new missions and try to find the best strategy for these new missions. So why these aspects of game knowledge? Why did I want to hammer this home? If I look back at the Bolt Action events that I attended before Band of Brothers, there was a couple of really concerning things that I saw. One was that people were taking the same lists to the same events. And I had actually even heard people say that they didn't even bother reading the player's pack anymore when they submitted lists. They knew that those lists were going to be accepted. This meant that there was kind of a lack of skill expression around list building, particularly if we limited to generic reinforced platoons and armies of, or units contained within armies of rulebooks. And that's a really great place to start. Those are some really great bread and butter tournament structures that I think certainly have a place. The problem was that once we started opening up to theater selectors and a few other things, people weren't bringing new lists. And we ended up in this place where everybody knew what a German list looked like, and everybody knew what a British list looked like, and a Russian one, and so on. And it got to the point where you could say one or two words about your list, and everybody knew what was in them. Now that sounds like the game had been solved, and viewers of the channel will know I strongly disagree that Bolt Action has been solved. What I think it actually spoke to more so was comfort zone. I think players just wanted to bring what they knew, and that was kind of the game that they had come to know. And after a while, that comfort zone meant that some of these other things weren't atrophied, and people couldn't express skills in all of these different areas, including list construction. It also meant that their knowledge of the game was actually quite limited because they weren't playing against different lists. To compound all of that, they were also playing the same kind of missions. So you had this, I'm recalcitrant to say stagnant situation, because I really don't want this to sound like a criticism of TOs or players. It's just more so that people came to expect a certain set of circumstances and missions and lists, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it meant that they weren't being challenged. They weren't given the opportunity to grow, and also, as I said, they weren't given the opportunity to express their skills in list construction and lots of different places. So now that I've laid out kind of the history of events around Bolt Action and where this event came from and what the event is, at least broadly, I now kind of want to step forward and be like, well, what's the criteria for success? What does this Band of Brothers event have to be for it to be successful by my measurement? And this is the criteria that I came up with. Firstly, the format has to be fun and balanced. Those two things are not necessarily overlapping, but for me, it was important that those two things occurred at roughly the same rate. Secondly, I wanted the event to create new relationships and or deepen existing ones. I wanted players to be challenged against new lists. I want players to be challenged to play new lists and construct new lists, but also to analyze other lists and to select favorable matchups. One key thing that was really important for me is that I wanted iconic missions and I wanted iconic prizes. I want there to be something about Band of Brothers, the missions or the prizes, that really draws you in. And the thing that I settled on was custom HE templates. Every time the event is run, I get a new set of templates printed and the captions around the ring changes. The reason I settled on HE templates was there's Skulls, which runs twice a year. And one of the prizes you can earn from that is custom order dice bag that are made specifically for that event. Of course, we have the silver order dice now from the amazing support through War and Peace and Warlord Games. And I wanted to kind of complete that game aid. What's the other thing that you need? And so that way, if you're somebody who goes to all of these events and does well, you should have a nice slew of iconic prizes that can communicate your success and your history. We've also recently had Spartan start up in the last couple of years. This is a hyper-competitive event, and the prize for that is a Spartan helmet. It's a trophy that needs to be returned. And that's an amazing thing. And I wanted Band of Brothers to add to that. If you saw a player come to an event and they either had a custom HE template and or a custom order dice bag and had silver order dice, it was celebrating that player's success. With all of those things, I wanted there to be mechanics in Band of Brothers that rewarded teams who did list building, selecting favorite matchups, and deepening those relationships. I wanted there to be mechanics that rewarded teams who did that really well. But because it was a new thing, I wanted there to be safety nets. So if somebody wasn't super familiar with it, they weren't unduly punished. The key thing about Band of Brothers is that it rewards players who read the pack, which is amazingly not guaranteed as a TO to expect of your players. It also will reward people who practice the missions. There are some important nuances about scoring in the missions of Band of Brothers, and it is about getting those reps in. The second to last part is that there needs to be a way to opt in. And what I mean by that is I don't want only players who do all of those things to attend the event. The reason is I want the barrier to entry to be low enough so people can come to the event and learn. I don't want this to be a seal clubbing exercise for people who are unfamiliar with the format and the event. The last part is the format needs to have a framework for all of this. As you can probably see, there are some things here that are a little bit counter to each other, and so a compromise has to be met. The safety nets have to exist to a point that if somebody was going to lose the game, they're going to lose it anyway, regardless of the safety net, because of poor play. However, I don't want somebody who makes a small error to be punished unduly, and that's kind of the idea. And the same again goes with the rewards. You want there to be a clear advantage to be earned by teams who build really thoughtful lists and great team compositions and choose good matchups, but you still don't want the game decided at the matchup point. I have said this many times before, and I will say it again. I think that list building and bolt action accounts for about 30 to 40% as an advantage of what's actually up on the table, and it's up to that amount. A lot of the times it doesn't factor in that much, particularly if you're playing some of these more well-structured formats with limitations and order dice and platoons and flamethrowers and things like this. However, that being said, there needs to be play left in it. If I'm going to change a lot of mechanics around bolt action, or list building at least, I need to make sure that those list buildings and those matchup processes do not result in outcomes that are guaranteed based on the matchup. So with that out of the way, let's move into what list building for Band of Brothers actually looks like. So players make a team of 3. One player is assigned an infantry platoon, another one is assigned an artillery platoon, another one is assigned an armor platoon. These are the things you can take. If we look at the artillery platoon, for your selector and your submitted list to count as an artillery platoon, it has to have 2 artillery units that are not multiple rocket launches. And then it can have more artillery units. You can include 1 armor value 8 or damage value 8 vehicle. Outside of that, you can bring whatever you want in an artillery platoon. As long as your selector that you choose enables you to do that, you're good to go. Artillery platoons and associated selectors are not particularly well represented for minor nations in bolt action, so I included an optional one at the back of the player's pack. Players could choose to use that one if they wanted. If we look at an armor platoon, basically you have to take 2 close top vehicles. One of them needs to be a medium tank. And then the infantry platoon is you basically have to not be an infantry or an armor platoon, is more or less what that comes down to be. Now, if your team opted in, and I've stressed that this is actually optional, your team could have submitted 3 lists of any type and you would have been good to go. If you were somebody who wasn't particularly competitively minded and didn't care about the outcome, just wanted to come and roll dice, your team of 3 was more than capable of doing that. There were some things that you missed out on. The first being assets. So after the draft process was done and the matchups were determined, if your team formed a combined arms platoon as detailed here, your team got access to 3 assets. And the assets would also then be drafted out. The last thing a combined arms platoon would obtain is access to secondaries. We'll get to those in a moment after we've gone through the drafting mechanics. Your team has submitted an infantry, list, an artillery list, and an armor list, and you have your assets with you. Now, and I'm, as a TO, will call out that Team A is matched up with Team B on tables 1, and table row 1 will contain 3 tables. These two teams are going to roll up. Their captains are going to lay down their lists and let their opponents' forces look at their lists as well. And then they're going to roll off for basically either A goes first or B goes first. Regardless of the roll, both teams simultaneously will put up 2 lists. And let's say Team A was selected as the roll. Team A then chooses which lists pair off. So which A list fights which B lists. Then the team that didn't select the matchup chooses the table out of the row of 3 for that matchup to play on. This means that if you ended up in a situation where you think your infantry platoon going up against an armor platoon was going to be really unfortunate and you needed a lot of terrain, you could have actually mitigated your losses by choosing that table. This would then repeat for the remaining lists. As you can see, with 3 lists on each team, you basically go through 2 rounds of this draft, and then the last team is the remaining matchup. Once you've done that, you're going to repeat it for the assets. You're going to go through the same thing. Now, why is the assets also drafted? The idea being that you can play a little game of poker, basically either forcing your opponent to mitigate their losses, or you can press your advantage, or vice versa. That's the idea of the drafting mechanics. You can see that the table and the assets are some safety nets put in place if you don't particularly do the matchups very well. Alternatively, your team can actually amplify and press those advantages with good table selection, good asset allocation, and also a good drafting strategy. So let's go worst case scenario. Let's say Team A just absolutely dominated the draft process. They got all of the matchups they wanted. They baited out all the assets where they wanted them to be wasted. They signed all their assets when they wanted, and they got the tables that they wanted. So how is the game actually scored? What's the last kind of safety net I can put in to make sure that even on these huge blowouts and these massive advantages, that everybody's still in the fight? And that's where the scoring comes in. For every game in Band of Brothers that's played, you can earn 15 points from the mission, and you can earn 15 points from secondaries. There was a unique set of 3 secondaries for each type of platoon, and I'm going to go through more of those in the next slide, but it suffices to say for now that you can score 5 points for each one, a max of 5 points, and so you have a total earnable 15 points. That means for any given game, I can earn up to 30, you can earn up to 30. At the end of the game, we tally up our scores, and we compare them. Let's say I scored 20 victory points, you scored 8. That's a difference of 12. You then look at the table and realize a victory point differential of 12 means that I, as the winner with 20 victory points, gain 7 tournament points, and you gain 3. That means you go back to your team with 3 points, even though it was a pretty serious blowout. You can see that the key thing here about the scoring mechanic is that if you're somebody who can score really well, you're going to do okay. But if you're somebody who can score really well and deny your opponent from scoring, that's when you're really going to bring home the bacon. And that's the key thing here, is that Band of Brothers is about working together as a team to get big wins and small losses at the same time. If you're really lucky, all 3 of your players are going to get 3 really good matchups, and you're going to get really, really big wins. Another thing that I needed to be really careful of about this scoring mechanic is that on paper, some platoons are going to be able to score objectives easier than others. Infantry platoons, for example, famously very good at taking ground and holding objectives. And artillery platoons, probably not as mobile, at least on paper, right? So I can mitigate some of those on paper challenges by changing the difficulty of the secondaries. I also expected armor platoons to dominate, having taken a bloody gold selector to a 900-point tournament, or it might have been 820 points. I had 2 medium tanks. I mean, admittedly, Shermans with their thin sides, not super expensive, but I had a pretty skinny list. Across a 4-round tournament, or it might have been 5 rounds, I lost 3 order dice the entire weekend. So I had expected armor platoons to absolutely dominate. So with those things in mind, I could make the armor platoons secondaries a little bit more difficult to score. The artillery one's a little bit easier. So here's the secondaries as I laid them out. The exact way to score the points is in the player's pack. I'm going to bombard you with a lot of data coming up soon. I didn't want to throw some more numbers at you, but you can see that there's a consistency to them in the sense that you want to keep your units alive. This is because I don't count kill points for Band of Brothers. It wasn't something that I had found represented the skill differences very well. And I was also kind of concerned that, again, if you look at it on paper, your armor platoons are going to have fewer order dice. So one kill there is not the same as a kill somewhere else. So instead I reflected that in the secondary points. The main thing I want to drive home about the armored platoons was, and infantry platoons actually, was aggression. I wanted your units in the opponent's half or in their deployment zone, keeping your precious units alive and doing the things that they do uniquely well. And for the artillery platoons, I wanted I wanted to make it a little bit easier. And so I kind of went with things that were expected to happen over the course of a game, such as zeroing in with indirect and rolling max pins or causing you to fail morale check. It's important to note that for all of these secondaries, you had to score things more than once to get the full 5 points. So you had to get more than one infantry unit in the enemy table half, things like this. You had to get more than one to earn the full 5. So that's kind of the core of the pack. That's the idea of Band of Brothers. Now let's talk a little bit about the event itself. I'm going to briefly break this into 2 parts. The first part is the prep work. I was able to secure a venue for an extremely affordable price, and that's basically due to a lot of lucky circumstances. I'm not going to pretend that it had anything to do with my skill. There's a wargaming club here in Perth, Outpost. They run open days, and they're very keen on running events during open days. And so I'm able to get a venue for very, very little. It also means that I can basically run the event for free. That's not a realistic expectation for myself that I had or for anybody, but does bear mentioning. Of course, leading up to that, I had to write the player's pack and choose the submissions. What you've seen up until this point is basically all of the work that went into writing a player's pack. And then some. You have to think about things like scheduling and prizes, whether you're going to run a painting competition and that sort of thing. Additionally, you securing some sponsorships and prizes. A lot of the iconic and unique prizes I actually get out of my own pocket. And that's something that I think is one part, it's only fair because the event is free. I can't really ask for anybody to pay for the prizes. But also, it's things that I want for the event. So I'm happy to pay for them, basically. A lot of the other sponsorships, of course, are free as well. So if you send out an email to a lot of different places, you'll actually be amazed at how many people are willing to sponsor you. So that would be my takeaway to budding TOs, is just send an email and you'll be surprised at how much help you get. Another big part of the lead up is actually helping people find teams and teammates. Bolt Action in Perth tends to be usually about 3, 4, maybe 5 people who know each other and they play with each other, and trying to create a 3-man team event usually ends up meaning that people get 1 or 2 friends to kind of invite along, and they're either missing a third or they actually just their friends can't come because of life or scheduling conflicts. So a lot of my time actually goes into making sure people find teams and teammates and introducing people to each other, which is fantastic. I've got all the time in the world for that. The second last part is, of course, I have to create scoring sheets for my players to keep track, as well as an Excel spreadsheet I call the TO helper. Sometimes it's more helpful than it isn't, or more often it's actually very helpful than it isn't, and that's something that has improved over the years. Although that being said, I would much rather move to something like Tawny Keeper, and I probably will very soon. The last part is beg, borrow, and steal terrain. We're very fortunate that most players have at least a table. So whenever we put up an event, we get a whole bunch of people bringing tables with them, and that's great. That's really amazing. So D-Day, what actually happened? So originally I had 21 players registered. This is a little lower than previous years. Previous years I've hit about 30. And the main reason I was down that many players was actually CanCon. It was happening the same weekend. So as I said, getting a free venue is amazing. Unfortunately, it means that sometimes you can't choose your own dates. But hey, I'm certainly not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, and 21 players is still amazing for an event. The day actually ran really smoothly. We went through the setup, and I had a lot of people come down early to do the setup. And then the matchups I actually did the night before, and I emailed them and put up Facebook posts about who's playing who for round 1. and as well as the bulk of the briefing I actually did the night before. It means we could hit the ground running on the day. One of the players suggested that in a previous event, and it's actually, I think, is a fantastic idea. I would strongly recommend a lot of TOs do that. I also had no qualms about issuing the matchups kind of 24 hours before, because the lists go public about 7 to 10 days before the event. And that means list submission is due 2 weeks before the event. What all that means is, of course, that people can actually study all of the potential matchups that might come through the day. They can go through all of their drafting processes on paper beforehand. And you can actually really see that the teams who did well are the teams who did that or who have done that previously. Then, of course, as the games are running, it's just roaming around and providing rules assistance. And then between rounds, you're entering scores and calculating matchups again. Spreadsheet does a lot of the work. And then right at the end of the day, deliver the presentation and do the pack-up. So as I said, the event went super well. With a couple of last-minute dropouts, I ended up having a team of 4, and one of those guys rotated throughout a bye, which was really great. Meant the event day could kick over. With the event completed and all the score sheets calculated and assessed, I'm in a kind of unique position here where I can basically analyze the event from a couple of different perspectives. The two main ones being quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative being what data, what are the numbers, and qualitative was how was the event? Was it actually fun? And I think it's really important that you use the right metric for the right things. You will get a lot of verbal feedback and you'll have a lot of conversations with people about the event. And that's really where you're trying to collect all of that qualitative information. It's like, yeah, it was really fun. This was really good. This was really bad, whatever. And then when you sit down with your score sheets, if you've collected enough data and the right data, you can actually perform some analysis on it and be like, well, actually, how did the day actually go from a numbers perspective? And I think it's really important that when you do that, you have to know what questions you're asking. Now, I think it's really easy to just go, oh, well, why don't I just lay out the criteria from before and have them as the questions that I'm asking? The problem is that sometimes your metric or the number that you have available is not directly related to your metrics. If I give you an example of a case where they actually really are very well related, if you're trying to save a set amount, say $1,000 for, and you're trying to have that in the next couple of months, your metric for that is how much money have you saved in that period of time? And that is directly related to your outcome. But if you talk about what I said before about a balanced tournament, well, I mean, balance, it is or it isn't. Is it a scale? And so you have to look at a couple of different things for balance. Now, there's a distinction I want to make here that I think is really important, is that fair versus balanced. Fair is a perspective. It's an emotional analysis, or it's an emotional impression of whether something is or it isn't fair. Balance, on the other hand, at least in this context, is arithmetic. It either is balanced by these metrics or it isn't. Now, I want this event to feel fair, and I also want it to be balanced. The important thing is events or circumstances can feel unfair, even though they are balanced. And vice versa, unbalanced things can feel fair. Fair, as we've just talked about, is a qualitative assessment. If you're trying to gauge fairness with data and score sheets, I suggest you're probably barking up the wrong tree. And what I did is I assessed fairness elsewhere, not necessarily by looking at this data. I did it by having conversations with people. But anyways, let's focus on the balance for this one. From my perspective, for a tournament to be balanced, there should be a bell curve of tournament points. And what do I mean by the bell curve? Is that there should be a normal distribution of the tournament points. The vast majority should be around that 6-4 range. I should have a little bit more around 7-3, and I should have very few on the far outside of that. Additionally, there should be comparable scoring rates. That is, that each individual platoon should, on net, have earned roughly the same percentage of victory points across the entire tournament throughout the entire day. That means that if I had high results and low results for one platoon in any particular mission, they should average out to be somewhere around the middle, and each platoon should be comparable to each other in terms of how many points they scored throughout the day. Additionally, there should be complementary outcomes of matchups. That is to say, if artillery wins predominantly against infantry, then infantry should win against armor by roughly the same amount, and then armor should beat artillery roughly the same amount, or whatever the rock, paper, scissors happens to be. on paper, the rock, paper, scissors that I expected was artillery beats armor, armor beats infantry, infantry beats artillery, basically on the concepts of mobility, firepower, and order dice being the three different key advantages that they have. Lastly, if we look at the actual leaderboard of the players rather than teams, we should see an even spread, a nice, pretty smooth distribution of victory points and tournament points, as well as all of the types of platoons should be roughly evenly spread out across that list. With those metrics in place, let's actually go look at the data. But for us to look at the data, we have to calculate it. If you're somebody who doesn't like math, honestly, just skip this part. We had 6 teams playing 3 rounds with 3 players each. You multiply that up, you end up with 54 games of data. Now, technically, it's actually 27 games, obviously because 2 players play 1 game. But you then have to remember that each game has 2 players and each player can score victory points independent of each other. And so I calculated that as a metric of percentage scored. That sounds a little bit confusing, but it's pretty straightforward. I get a max of 15 primaries per player per game. That means I can sum all of the primaries scored for all of the artillery platoons in round 1. I can divide it by 15 times the number of artillery platoons that played round 1, multiply it by 100, and I will get a percentage. And that percentage is how many primary points were scored out of all of the ones that could have possibly been scored. We're not going to worry about that percentage scored right now. First things first, let's look at that bell curve of tournament points. So this bell curve, or a frequency histogram, you have the tournament points across the bottom. If you call back, roughly every 3 or 4 victory points ended up as 1 tournament point in difference. And this is an indicator for how the matchups go, generally speaking. If we look at round 1 in that kind of dark gray color, all of them were between 7 to 3 tournament points, which is a pretty good indicator that it's working. So as I said, 4 to 6 is kind of your first instance where you're moving away from draws and start moving to wins. And 7 to 3 is when you start getting some comfortable wins, but they're not huge blowouts. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. Look at round 2. Round 2, again, most of them are clustered around 7 to 3, but you had one game that went 9-1 and another one that went 10-0. Those are some 2 huge blowouts that occurred. So 2 out of 27 games, about 10%. That's a fairly reasonable percentage of huge blowouts as far as I'm concerned. Round 3 was extremely tight with a lot of draws. And now if we look at all of those rounds together, we can see that if you're running Swiss pairing like I was with a random seed round 1 and then winners face winners for round 2 and 3, this is typically what we actually see in tournaments here, in 3-round tournaments with Swiss pairings, is that you see a lot of variation in round 1 because it's a random matchup. And round 2 is when the people with lucky, easy games, say, for example, somebody who's slightly above average and a little bit salty came up against a newbie. Then in round 2, they come up against an actual, good player. And then they get politely reminded that they're just above average and only a little bit salty. Round 3, you've had basically 2 rounds of skill-based matchmaking occurring. And so now you get a really nice fine-tuned who should be versing who, and you get some very tight games. All of that is to say that this frequency histogram to me tells me that by and large, the format's actually pretty well balanced. Arithmetic. Again, I'm focusing on like a data perspective here, is that if you come to Band of Brothers, there is like a 95% chance you're going to get a decent win or a small loss. And there's a less than 10% chance you're going to end up with a huge blowout. I think that's a really good place to start. And so I wanted to kind of look forward and see, okay, broadly speaking, if we average it all out, we're getting a fairly distribution. We're getting a normal distribution of tournament points, a nice bell curve. So what happens when we start looking at matchups? What happens when you get one platoon facing another platoon? So here I've got some sunburst charts. So we could just look at the first one to talk about how a sunburst chart works. The outside circle is the outcomes for win-loss draws. If we look at the left circle, the green section is the infantry versus infantry matchup. The outside ring tells you how many games they won, lost, or drawed against infantry platoons. The gray one is for armor, blue one is for artillery. So this sunburst chart allows us to look at two things at the same time, or three things technically. How many games did they play against what platoons? What proportion do those numbers represent? And how likely were they to win or lose in any given matchup? Looking at the sunburst charts, people were very keen on putting infantry into infantry, and armor and artillery, they favored mirror matchups or putting armor into artillery or artillery into armor. Looking across the board, the only major skew here is that artillery beats armor. Artillery platoons played 9 games against armor, and they won 6 of them, drew 2 of them, and only lost 1 of those games. So there's a clear matchup advantage to artillery platoons going into armor. And then if you look at infantry versus armor, that's about a 50-50, and mirror matchups are 50-50 as well. That means that in terms of rock, paper, scissors, the armor is not really doing their rock, paper, scissors thing, but also that artillery platoons had a fairly easy day. So we would expect them to score a little bit higher in a few places. So that's something that we need to look at. Now, we have to be very careful here. Did artillery platoons win more games because they had good matchups? Or did they win more games because their secondary structures and secondary points and their ability to score primaries was actually just better, and armor was in a worse spot to score points? That's something we're going to look at very shortly. The other thing we probably want to point out here is that people are very keen to protect their infantry platoons and the infantry team members, being careful to shield them from armor and artillery. Whether that's got to do with the fact that people chose the infantry matchups and maybe that was their infantry counter on paper, I can't say from here. I obviously wasn't there for every single draft, every single matchup process, and why. So now let's look at the actual scoring. What points did what platoon score, how, and when? So here we have the percent scoring, which is what we talked about before. You have the individual secondaries for each platoon. Then you have the sum percentage of all of the secondaries combined. Then lastly, you have the percentage primary, and it's broken down by the 3 missions. The missions are in the players pack. They're all custom ones from an upcoming HMG mission pack. Some of the missions have been around a little while, like Finest Hour and Bite and Hold. Comradeship of Friends is a new one that Jacob has recently written, and that one should be deploying very soon as part of the mission pack. So what can we see here? If we look at the primaries, infantry struggled a fair bit in round 1 compared to round 2 and 3, but not much. Hanging all 3 rounds are hanging around 30% of earned primaries across the event. Armor really struggled in round 1 and 2, and more or less overall, actually, looking at their percentage for the individual secondaries and all the secondaries put together. Their ability to keep their tanks alive is actually fairly high, which is good. It means that secondary is more or less working. And then if we look at artillery, really struggled in primaries in round 1, but just absolutely dominated in rounds 2 and 3. If we look at the secondaries for all the 3 platoons, we can see that the infantry secondaries seem to be fairly mission dependent. They seem to be scored very reliably in Bite and Hold, which is a mission that encourages a lot of maneuver, and you can also choose where your objectives are deployed after you know which side of the table, so that makes sense to me. The armor secondaries were really unreliable, and it is something that I think probably contributed to their losses a lot. And then if we look at the artillery secondaries, they're very reliable. So on net, what have we got? We've got armor struggling to score primaries, artillery just scoring out the wazoo, except for Finest Hour. And interestingly, they scored really well in Comradeship of Friends, which is a first wave mission, so I was very surprised by that. And infantry scoring is more or less about what's typical. So something needs to be said here about the chicken and the egg, or the cart and horse. If we go back to the previous slide and think about that artillery won the armor matchups, was artillery able to score really highly because they went into their preferred counter matchup? Or is artillery just easier scoring in general, and armor is just harder scoring in general. And then the reason they won and lost those matchups was actually because of the scoring, not because of the matchup. Definitely a cart and horse question there. I think looking at the design of the secondaries, I'm more so leaning to easier scoring by artillery in the secondaries particularly was a pretty big advantage, and that the more difficult to score armor secondaries were compounding on that matchup. So that's probably going to be a strong focus for when I review this pack for the next Band of Brothers. Now comes that last question is, what does the actual leaderboard look like? So if you want to kind of pause here and look through all of it in great detail, you're welcome to. I'm just going to kind of breeze through this real quick, just point out a couple of key features. If you see a 0.5 on there, that's just an indicator to me that some result in there was filled in by a bye. And so it would have just been average for the primaries or the secondaries for that round. That's just a visual indicator that that player played a bye. You have the round 1 primaries as a total, the round 1 secondaries as a total, and then the tournament points earned after that. If we cut the table in half, right around that middle section, you can see that the top half is dominated by artillery, the bottom half is dominated by armor. Infantry is fairly evenly spread in the second half, but not so much in that first half. That being said, though, the person who won the event was an infantry player, and if we have a look at their tournament points, no real surprise there. That main difference is not only did they score really highly, but to have scored 20 points and 7 victory points, they would have had to have beat their opponent by 12 points. And then if we look at round 2, they scored the 430. For them to get the 10, their opponent must have scored 3 points or less that round. So you can see that this really has a very strong indicator that while, yes, the person who took out the event is infantry, and while, yes, they scored really well, and yes, they did that by preventing their opponent from scoring, there is not an even distribution of the platoons across the leaderboard, which means some platoons have an easier time, some platoons have a harder time. So, all in all, how does this format actually look like? What can we actually deduce from it? Firstly, it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of people laughing and smiling, and I had a building in a room full of people having the time of their life. Lots of laughter, lots of dice were being rolled, and a lot of people coming up and thanking me for the event and saying that they couldn't wait for the next one. So that's anecdotal. I obviously didn't keep a score, and it is a qualitative measurement, but a tick on that one as far as I'm concerned. So were players challenged to play new lists and against new lists? Absolutely. The lists that came through and all the ones that were approved, each one was unique. There was a lot of different flavors of lists, and there was different amounts people leaned into and away from the skews and the strengths and the weaknesses. So that was really good to see. I also had a lot of players saying, I really didn't know how to play with this list, and I really didn't know how to play against that list. And some saying I was really glad to get those practice games in. So that's a big tick for me. Now we can start looking at some of the data here. The matchups indicate that the matchup outcomes indicate that players who select favorable matchups win more. So there's an indicator there that mechanic works, which is good. If we then look at the spread of the tournament points and the few outliers, that indicates that there are mechanics that mitigate failures, right? So even though we had some pretty big like wins losses in terms of 12 15 victory point differentials out of 30, there was enough safety nets in there that it didn't massively hugely skew the event. But at the same time, it meant that those players who played really well and did all the right things came out on top. And just to kind of hammer that point home, even though we identified some strong advantages in artillery secondaries and some weaknesses in the armor secondaries, the person who still came out on top was playing an infantry platoon, which means those core mechanics of bolt action are still the things that allows you to win even at an event like this. And I think that's really important, is that while those mechanics are there that reward the thorough play testing, reward the good list building and the team compositions and the matchups and so on, at the end of the day, being a good bolt action player is what makes you win at Band of Brothers. And that's really important. The last one here is, yes, all of these structures and all these additional features in here, but does the opt-in work? Was there a barrier to entry? Well, first off, no one actually decided not to come as a combined arms platoon. So I think that's a good start. That means everybody who wanted to be there wanted to try the new format, which is great. But also actually had quite a few new players. We had 2 teams that were almost wholly new players, and we also had a smattering of new players across the other teams. And those new teams didn't actually do that badly. One of the teams had 2 new players, ended up as the second best team overall. That's actually the best allied team, which is fantastic. So that indicates to me that while the format has all of this flavor, has all of these angles, these cool mechanics, and that they work, they don't provide barrier to entry, both in terms of actually new players attending and doing well. So overall, I'm pretty happy that to call Band of Brothers framework as being robust and one that achieves the things that I set out to achieve. But let's call a spade a spade. It's not a perfect framework. No framework ever will be. There are definitely some things about the pack that I'm going to review for the next time around, particularly starting with those secondaries. I had an assumption that now, with the benefit of hindsight and data, I can say was wrong. That assumption was that artillery platoons would struggle on primary, and that's just not true, which is great. We learned. And now that next pack's going to be even better, and it's going to be even more finely tuned. Hopefully next time around, I'm going to see more of this. I'm going to see all of these new lists coming through. I'm going to see all of these new relationships being forged, people being introduced to new players they can play Bolt Action with, new missions challenged in lots of new ways, and that people are going to have a good time, because that's ultimately why we all do this. And I think for those are players who aren't necessarily knowing what goes on to actually bring an event together, I hope that this is actually giving you some kind of insight into the design and the brainstorming process about creating new events and why the things go in there, and also the intentional compromises that somebody has to make when they put an event together. I would love to be able to have an event where every player can come there and get what they want, but we can't. That's not how events work. That's actually not how anything in life works. At the risk of pontificating, I'm just going to stop there. But the key thing to realize is that each event on your calendar, locally or slightly more regionally, if your country's small and very dense in terms of Bolt Action players, is that each event offers something different. I really encourage players to go to all of the different events, even if it sounds like something that is outside your comfort zone or not something you would normally go and attend. Why? Because the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to have a good time. And the best thing that's going to happen is you're going to become a better Bolt Action player and also make new friends. As a final sign off to everybody who either is a TO or is thinking about a TO or has burnt out for being a TO, consider this a thank you letter to all of you. The group of TOs around Perth are amazing, and it's their support that made this event come to life and kind of pushed me to actually be able to run this event and stood behind me and supported me to make this event come true. And of course, none of that would be possible without the players. And I thank them all profusely several times for coming to Band of Brothers and giving me the feedback and coming back to the event and all the other sorts of stuff. But this is my message to all of the other TOs out there. It's worth it. Run the event that you want to run. People will want to be there. They will come and they will have the best time. And they're having a great time because you decided to put that event on. With that being said, I hope to see more events and more TOs filling up everybody's calendar, just like it is here. Thanks for tuning into that video of Western Tabletop and bearing through a death by PowerPoint. We'll see you in the next one.